Two pages, chapter 7. The chapter that all you teens were looking forward to. Chapter 7, relevant to marriage and remarriage. Now, this is relevant to you, I'm sure. We'll start off with a comment by Sjogren, who we have been referencing now and again. Sjogren, Dr. Sjogren, who says, we need to tell teenagers not only what they should do, but why. And in that respect, that's where we're going today. Now, this first verse. Does anybody know the first verse? Anybody quote the first verse? No? Well, okay, we'll continue. Now, this first verse is a vast improvement over the previous NIV. Sjogren, and this is a response, clearly, to a pretty dumb question by Chloe and her crackers. It's not something proposing just something out of the blue, as it looks. Paul's not just proposing something out of the blue, as it appears in the previous NIV. And that should have been pretty obvious to the old NIV. The mood and the context indicate as much. And P46, that manuscript we've been talking about, should have sealed the deal with its punctuation as well. It's a problem because progress in interpretation can be painfully slow at times, and this chapter is no exception. So, the dumb question is whether or not it is good to touch a woman. Touch being used in the very same mocking sense used by Paul in Colossians 2:21 and numerous places. Touch meaning to become one flesh with a woman. To become one flesh as commanded by their very well-known verse of Genesis 1:28 and 2:24. Or whether those crackers ought to remain gluten-free. Whether they ought to pass on that commandment of touching other crackers, to pass on that commandment in order for greater purification of their souls. A pretty dumb question, really, when you consider this as a divine commandment. Clearly, those gluten-free lightweights didn't think there was some purifying effects from being married, which Paul says there are in verse 14, or some purifying effects from having children, as Paul says in 1 Timothy 2:15. They must not have been married to begin with, or they must have never touched anyone either, or else they would have known far, far better. Carrying on. However, many commentators suggest that those crackers were currently married. What? Yes, that those married crackers were just concerned that the recreation part of their marriage might happen to be wicked wrong. Thinking that there should be no fun and games involved in touching. Well, it seems many commentators can be just as dumb at times. As if any married folks were ever able to separate the fun from the marital duty entirely. And even if they could, would they tell their spouse that they were no fun? Not likely. That was the silly ideal of the great first century philosopher Philo, who is in view here. A philosopher who said that sort of recreation for pigs and goats. In essence, that the recreation part was only to be enjoyed with someone other than your spouse. Enjoyed with one of your slaves, students, or one of the temple prostitutes instead. But, that ascetic interpretation fails miserably by the poorest of philosophy, and fails in Pauline context as well. So I don't know why that currently married hypothesis ever gets suggested by so many otherwise good scholars. It seems to critically skew their noodles and constantly divert us from the real question of this chapter. So, in effect, Paul says that you should get married if you have passion. And that is a word that has been helpfully added by our NIV. That you should get married, since it is far, far better to marry than to burn with passion, in verse 9. Then, we see the reason that Paul didn't get married is because he didn't burn with passion, he says in verse 7. Perhaps he was one of the same misogynistic women haters mindset as Tertullian way back then. Perhaps thinking that girls are icky, thinking that woman is a temple built over a sewer. Nasty. But I highly doubt that Paul thought that way. Rather, I suspect he was just way too busy to accommodate a woman. As one of our commentators, Mayer, believes. Even busier than Calvin and Luther, apparently, who eventually conceded to getting married themselves. Calvin married a widow, and Luther married an escaped Catholic nun. Or perhaps Paul was of the mindset of a younger Martin Luther, who wrote, "My mind is averse to wedlock, because I daily expect the death of a heretic." That could have been Paul's mindset. Which reminds me of a Canadian friend, a friend busily traveling the world in order to prove the existence of God, as if that needs to be proven. And then meeting an attractive American widow, a widow of a dear friend of his who had recently died, and even having his very aged mother border hopping to meet this American widow. But finally refusing to marry this American widow because they had an opposing view on baptism. Oh. Talk about silly divisions among crackers. Then, Paul goes on about how much husband and wife must fulfill each other's passion. There, it seems the NIV's should fulfill is way too soft. The must parallels Paul's honor to whom honor is due of Romans verse 7, and parallels that fulfilling of your vows to the Lord of Matthew 5:32, according to the Greek. According to our very finest lexicon as well. Something that looks an awful lot like a must to me rather than a should. And should probably look like a pretty big must to you if you get married. But how about that for serious equality from Paul? A command that applies to both husband and wife. An exceedingly great command, not a suggestion by any means, that would undoubtedly reduce sexual immorality, as Paul suggests in verse 2. The concession part of verse 6, however, refers to making some temporary concessions of your passions for stuff mentioned in the previous verse. Making temporary concessions by mutual consent for some other extreme reason. And here, fasting is not in the better manuscripts. Consent which is more often than not begrudgingly given by the other spouse, whether for extended military service or for extreme evangelistic expeditions which Paul embarked upon. And then, on to the commandment against divorce. And separation is not an option, it's never mentioned here. Verse 12. Yet another must from Paul in verses 10, 11, 12, 13. A commandment enforced as a rule by Paul in verse 17. However, then we get to verse 15, a verse about abandonment by a non-believer. The believer is then said to be not bound. Not bound by such a situation. But not bound to what? To what? Not bound to remarry? Well, that is the matter of debate here. A huge debate over what is called the Pauline privilege to remarry. As if Jesus didn't grant that privilege. when we even see priests commanded to marry widows and prostitutes in the Old Testament. And there's the references there as well. But what could not bound possibly mean otherwise? What, not bound to exercise their mandatory marital duty? Verse 3? Well, that is way more than a moot point if you are abandoned now, isn't it? That is a serious waste of ink and inkling by Paul if that is the stupid case. And that freed aspect that is addressed in verse 39, where the widow is then freed to remarry, well, I am not convinced that this freedom only applies to a woman, or convinced that this freedom only applies to the death of a spouse, or to adultery by a spouse, along with other commentators. Rather, I believe that divorce may legitimately apply to a number of gross immoralities, which we see in Matthew 5:32. Immoralities such as homosexuality and bestiality, to be consistent with the Old Testament in Leviticus 20, which we mentioned earlier last week. And it may apply to a number of gross indecencies in the Old Testament as well in Deuteronomy chapter 24. Indecencies such as gross domestic violence or abandonment, for instance, in Exodus 21:10. A belief that is supported by psychologist J. Adams and Tyndale historian David Instone Brewer. A belief where Old Testament marriage and divorce restrictions still apply in our day and age. And I believe that those restrictions did not merely come from Moses either, as suggested by many armchair theologians. And I believe that Jesus did not change those divine restrictions either. Nor is there any indications of those restrictions being reformed in Hebrews 9, verse 10 either. And it seems that Paul did not recognize any change to those divine restrictions with respect to marrying your stepmother either, as we mentioned earlier. Now, I am not just being an armchair theologian here either, as you might think. I made that strong belief relevant in my own personal life when I remarried 13 years ago. So I'm not just talking out of my hat here. Yet I did not run headlong into remarriage, which is what the following verses go on and on about. My non-believing wife, ex-wife rather, had more than ample time to be reconciled to me as preferred by Paul in verse 11. More than ample time. My ex-wife had much more than the period that I would posit for others in such a situation. A period after which I removed my ex-wife's credit card privileges, which forced her to make up her scattered mind and get a divorce. Period. Over. And to that end, I remained in that current state as Paul recommended in verse 20. I remained unmarried for over 7 years. Unmarried until I was called to be in a different state, which we read in verses 17, 20, 21, on and on. Called by seeming coincidence, as well as being called by Scripture to change that bereft state. But what about this other bereft state that Paul goes on about? The next passage, which is said to be one of the most difficult passages of the entire Pauline corpus by a commentator called Moiser. Something about virgins in verse 36. Something about keeping someone a virgin. about keeping someone unmarried. What kind of nonsense is that about? Is that not treachery? Is that not sinful? This too is a puzzle for many, many commentators. And I'm not at all happy with the NIV translation there either. Not happy at all, since I think it refers to you passionate young people. Yes, you quizzers. And along with the NASB and other commentators, Augustine, Calvin, Luther, Morris, and more, I happen to think it refers to you young people being prevented from getting married. Refers to you being prevented from getting married by your parents for a prolonged period of time. Or perhaps being prevented by a confused Catholic Church where priests are prevented from marrying. A situation in which they are sinning against you. Yes, our NIV text says sinning. And there are no textual variants there. All the manuscripts say sinning against you. Whereas other commentators like Fee and Garland is an excellent commentary that I actually found for this, and many others seem to think that this situation merely refers to a boyfriend trying to keep his girlfriend as a perpetual virgin. Now, what kind of boyfriend is this anyways? Is he a eunuch or just a coward? So, which of the above interpretations is right? Well, according to the principle given, both interpretations are right. So don't be kept from getting married, and don't be keeping from getting married either, if you are a parent. Yeah, how long might that period of parental keeping be? Or how long might that period of girlfriend keeping be? Well, both our NIV and ESV fail us miserably here. Not even trying to suggest a period at all. A Greek word, since all manuscripts carry a Greek word that these versions do not translate at all. A word that is traditionally interpreted as not past the bloom of your youth. A rather vague period, a period which Calvin suggests is from 12 to 20 years of age. Or, as the 1989 NRSV more properly interprets it, if his passions are strong. Or if her passions are strong, of course. Which takes us right back to the beginning of this chapter, right? Right back to the first verse. And even all the way back to Adam and Eve. When Adam was gifted with a strong passion, but had no one to share it with, till Eve. So, now you quizzers have been given the precept to get married, the principle, if you have a strong passion, and the precedent, as you were called, for this divine command to marry. Relevant or not?